Have you ever stood before a 19th century building and felt not admiration but a kind of unease? As if the structure were older than it had any right to be, as if it had witnessed something far grander than mere practical necessity, something more precise than any reasonable expectation. As though the official story, built in 1874, built in 1861, by this architect for that purpose, failed to reach the true depths of what you were seeing, because something had happened before all of that. Something catastrophic. A reset so complete that it buried the ground floors of buildings across every continent. You can see it in photographs, first-floor windows sitting at ankle height, swallowed by earth in cities with no geological reason for it. Some call it a mud flood. Others point to plague, to war, to something we still lack language for. We don't know what it was, but the buildings remember, and the maps remember. Before a certain decade, maps show a civilization spanning most of the known world, Tartaria. Then, in the same years the earth seems to have swallowed those streets whole, it vanishes from the cartographic record. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. And in the silence after that erasure, someone built simultaneously on every inhabited continent hundreds upon hundreds of monumental stone structures. Post offices that look like palaces, train stations that look like cathedrals, courthouses with ventilation systems we struggle to replicate today, and asylums, asylum after asylum after asylum, each bearing an unsettling exactness to all the others. All of it raised, we are told, by men with horses and hand tools, in timelines that simply do not add up. They weren't built. They were inherited. And if someone inherited the buildings, the question nobody in the official record wanted to ask is, what did they do with the people still inside them? Where did they take the last Tartarians? Let me tell you what we're told. We're told that the mid-19th century saw a humanitarian revolution in the treatment of the mentally ill. We're told that reformers like Dorothea Dix campaigned tirelessly to move the insane out of poorhouses and prisons and into purpose-built institutions. We're told that the Kirkbride-plan, a specific architectural philosophy developed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride in 1854, became the dominant template for asylum construction across the United States, and remarkably, across much of the developed world. That's the official explanation. And it collapses here, because when you actually look at the Kirkbride buildings, when you stand inside the ones that still remain, you are not looking at hastily constructed institutional housing. You are looking at the most sophisticated architecture of the era. Grand staircases, ventilation systems of remarkable complexity. Vaulted ceilings, decorative stonework that would have required master craftsmen working for years, steam heating systems integrated into the walls, gaslighting infrastructure threaded through stone corridors. These are not buildings that a fledgling post-colonial republic threw up in a decade to house its troubled citizens. These are buildings that were already there. Or something very like them was. And here's the strangest part. The timeline doesn't work. The Kirkbride-plan was published in 1854. Within 15 years, hundreds of these monumental complexes had been constructed across the United States alone. At a time when there were no power tools, no steel frame construction, no automobile transport for materials, no national labor market. A building of this complexity, built today with all our modern machinery, would take 5 to 10 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. They built dozens of them simultaneously. Who built them? Where did the skilled labor come from? Where are the construction records, the quarry contracts, the accounts of the massive disruption such projects would have caused to surrounding communities? The silence is deafening. By 1880, there were over 140 public psychiatric institutions operating in the United States. Pause on that number. 140 institutions, each housing on average several hundred patients, some housing over 1,000. The Willard Asylum in New York held over 2,000 at its peak. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, the Napa State Hospital in California, all of them filled rapidly, efficiently, quietly, almost as soon as they opened. We are told these patients came from poorhouses and prisons and the private homes of overwhelmed families. We are told that industrialization had created a new class of the mentally disturbed, that urban crowding and alcohol and the stresses of modern life had broken the minds of ordinary people in unprecedented numbers. Maybe. But when you look at the admission records that survive, and many of them conspicuously do not, you find categories of diagnosis that have no modern equivalent. Moral insanity. Nostalgia. That one is particularly striking. Nostalgia, the uncontrollable longing for a home that no longer exists. This was classified in the 1860s and 1870s as a legitimate form of mental illness, requiring institutional confinement. Who was nostalgic? For what home? For what world? The official explanation says these were homesick soldiers, immigrants missing the old country, rural people displaced by industrialization. But the evidence suggests something much larger may have been happening, because the timing is not incidental. The great wave of asylum construction begins in earnest in the 1840s and 1850s. This is the same decade in which the maps begin to change. The same decade in which Tartaria, or whatever we choose to call the prior civilization, the one whose buildings still stand in every city in the world, begins to disappear from official cartography. The 1860 Steeler Atlas still shows Tartaria. By 1880, it is gone. Not conquered, not absorbed, not renamed. Simply gone. Excised as though it had never been there. And simultaneously, the asylums fill. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this investigation resonates with you, if these patterns trouble you as much as they trouble me, consider sharing it. The questions we ask together are harder to silence than the questions we ask alone. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were transported by rail from the cities of the eastern seaboard to rural towns across the Midwest, the Great Plains, and the American South. This was the Orphan Train movement, organized primarily by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. The official explanation: these were the abandoned and orphaned children of urban poverty, given a fresh start with farm families who needed labor. The deeper I went, the stranger this became. Because 250,000 is not a number that emerges from ordinary urban poverty. Not in the mid-19th century. Not in a country of 30 million people. The cities of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were not, by any reasonable demographic analysis, generating abandoned children at the rate required to fill those trains. Where did they come from? Some researchers, and I want to be careful here, because I am presenting a pattern, not a conclusion, some researchers have noted that the collection points for orphan train children were frequently in the same neighborhoods, the same buildings, the very same institutional complexes that processed the newly arrived inmates of the asylum system. That the children and the lunatics, as they were categorized, moved through parallel bureaucratic channels that occasionally, uncomfortably intersected. The children had no surnames in many documented cases, or they had surnames that were assigned to them upon arrival at the distribution points. Germanic surnames, Slavic surnames, names that suggested origins in cultural communities that were, by the official history, not supposed to exist in significant numbers in North America. Not Irish names, not English names, not the names you would expect from the impoverished immigrant communities of Five Points and the Lower East Side. Different names. Older names. Names from somewhere else. This raises a simple but critical question: if these children were truly the orphans of ordinary urban poverty, why did so many of them arrive without any documentation of prior existence? Here is where the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In state after state, country after country, the story follows the same template. A large pre-existing structure, a structure that the local historical record cannot adequately explain, is acquired by the newly formed state apparatus in the 1840s, 1850s, or 1860s. It is repurposed as an asylum, an orphanage, a workhouse, or a poorhouse. A new face is put on an old building. New records begin. Prior records are absent. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Western Virginia, construction officially began in 1858, but anyone who has examined the stonework, the hand-cut sandstone blocks, the foundations, the precision of the masonry has noted what the official construction timeline cannot explain: the sheer volume of cut stone present in that structure represents years, perhaps decades, of quarrying and dressing work. Not 10 years, not 20. The labor calculus simply does not resolve. The Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, Bedlam as it was known, has a documented history stretching back to 1247. But the building that stands, the building that was photographed in the 1850s and 1860s, the building that held thousands of patients in its long echoing galleries. It was rebuilt, we are told, in 1815. In 3 years. A structure of that magnitude in 3 years. The Charenton Asylum outside Paris, the Mierenberg in the Netherlands, the Berghalsli in Zurich. All of them massive. All of them appearing in the historical record with a suspicious abruptness. All of them, when you look carefully at the architectural details, displaying features that predate their official construction dates by generations. Not renovated buildings, not expanded buildings. Buildings that were simply there. And then suddenly explained. And here's the strangest part, the architectural language of these institutions is identical to the architectural language of the civic buildings, the train stations, the post offices, the courthouses, the universities, that appear in the same period and that the Tartaria researchers have been documenting for years. The same Beaux-Arts details, the same impossible scale, the same ventilation systems, the same proportions. The official explanation says these were built by the same movement, the same reforming impulse of the Victorian era that simply loved grand public buildings. But why would the same architectural sensibility govern both civic grandeur and the containment of the insane? Unless the buildings weren't built for those purposes. Unless the buildings were already there, and purposes were found for them. Between 1820 and 1900, hundreds of utopian communities appeared across the United States and, to a lesser extent, across Australia and South America. This is well-documented history. New Harmony, Indiana, founded 1825. The Oneida Community in New York, 1848. The Amana Colonies in Iowa, 1855. Brook Farm in Massachusetts. The Icarian communities of Illinois and Texas. The list extends to over 700 documented communities in North America alone. The official explanation: these were idealistic experiments in communal living driven by religious enthusiasm, socialist theory, and the peculiar freedom of the American frontier. But look at the demographics. Many of these communities appear to have arrived already formed, not built gradually by converts and settlers, but appearing with their organizational structures intact, their trades already distributed, their buildings already functional. Visitors who documented them in their early years frequently noted with surprise how established these communities seemed, how little of the fumbling improvisation you would expect from a new social experiment was visible. And the skills. The Amana colonies were from their founding producing high-quality textiles, furniture, and precision instruments, not learning to produce them. Producing them as though the knowledge had been carried there from somewhere else, intact and complete. The Harmony Society of Pennsylvania, the Rappites, arrived from Germany in 1804 and within a decade had built 2 model towns of such sophistication that visitors compared them to the great cities of Europe. Then they dismantled everything and moved to Indiana, then moved again, leaving behind each time buildings that the next settlers could not explain and could barely maintain. The evidence suggests something much larger may have been occurring in these communities than simple religious utopianism. Were they refugees? Were they the communities that absorbed the last survivors of whatever had occurred, the mud flood, the plague, the Great Resetting, whatever we choose to call it, the people who could not be institutionalized because they still had too much knowledge, too much social cohesion, too much of the prior world still intact in them? And that's where the orphan trains become impossible to ignore again. Because the distribution maps of the orphan train destinations and the distribution maps of the utopian communities are not identical, but they rhyme. The children were sent west. The communities were already there. And some researchers have noted, carefully, tentatively, that certain community records from the 1860s and 1870s show an influx of children with no documented prior history. Children who were absorbed quietly and without fanfare into the communal structure. Not documented as orphans, not listed as arrivals. Simply present in the later records when they were absent from the earlier ones. And here is where the official explanation finally, definitively breaks. Because this was not an American phenomenon. In the same decade that Dorothea Dix was campaigning for asylums in the United States, similar campaigns were underway in Britain, in France, in the German states, in Australia, in Canada, in Argentina. The same architectural templates, the same diagnostic categories, the same sudden appearance of large pre-existing or rapidly constructed buildings filled almost immediately with populations that the demographic record cannot fully account for. The Yarra Bend Asylum in Melbourne, Australia, 1848. The Gladesville Hospital in Sydney, 1838. The Sunnyside Hospital in Christchurch, New Zealand, 1863. All of them following the Kirkbride logic, or something functionally identical to it, before Kirkbride's plan had been widely distributed, before the age of mass communication, before the telegraph had connected these continents in any reliable way. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. How do you coordinate a worldwide institutional project in the 1840s and 1850s? How do you ensure that Australia and New Zealand and South America and the United States and Western Europe all adopt functionally identical approaches to the containment of an unspecified population simultaneously, with no visible communication infrastructure capable of achieving that coordination? The official explanation says it was simply the spread of ideas through professional networks, through the circulation of texts and journals, through the natural diffusion of Enlightenment humanitarianism. But ideas don't build buildings. Ideas don't fill institutions. Ideas don't process 250,000 children through a railway network. Something coordinated this. Something moved. The deeper you go into the archive, the more you notice what isn't there. Not the evidence that contradicts the official narrative, that would be manageable, explicable. No, what you notice is the absence, the gaps, the records that should exist and do not, the transition periods that are undocumented, the populations that appear in one census and vanish in the next. The 1850 census categories in the United States include a designation that by 1870 has disappeared entirely. Not evolved, not renamed. Disappeared, as though someone went back through the bureaucratic architecture and removed a category of person. You see that the admission records of several major asylums, the Willard, the Utica, the Trans-Allegheny, show periods of several years in the 1860s where intake documentation is either absent, damaged, or recorded in a format inconsistent with the records immediately before and after. Not a fire, not a flood. Simply different, as though a different system was briefly in operation and then quietly regularized. The orphan trains, for all that 250,000 children is a well-documented number, are remarkably poorly documented at the individual level. The placing out records that survive are fragmentary. The receiving families were not always required to maintain documentation. The children were, in many cases, legally renamed upon placement. Their prior identities were not preserved, not accidentally, not through bureaucratic negligence, through policy. The silence was deafening once I began to listen for it. There is a collection of objects recovered from the walls of the Danvers State Hospital during its demolition in the early 2000s, sealed into the walls, not hidden in any obvious sense, simply present inside the structure. Objects that should not have been there. Not modern objects, not institutional objects. Personal objects, a small carved wooden figure in a style that does not correspond to any identified folk tradition of the northeastern United States. A collection of documents written in a cursive script that the archivists who handled them described as resembling, but not identical to, several Eastern European languages. A set of instruments whose purpose was not identified. What knowledge did they carry? The last people who came through those doors, what did they remember that we have forgotten? And who decided that what they remembered was madness? This raises the final question, the one I cannot answer, the one I'm not sure anyone alive can answer. If a civilization was erased, if a world-spanning culture of sophisticated people was dispersed, institutionalized, orphaned, absorbed into utopian communities and railway cars and the long corridors of the Kirkbride buildings, what happened to what they knew? What happened to the techniques, the cosmology, the understanding of materials and proportion and energy that built those impossible buildings in the first place? Did it die with them in the asylums? Did it survive in fragments? In the skills of the Amana craftsman, in the strange productivity of the Harmony Society, in the children placed with farm families in Nebraska and Kansas who never knew their real names? Or is it still there, waiting, sealed into walls, written in scripts we don't recognize, carried in the muscle memory of traditions whose origins we have stopped thinking to question? I began this investigation skeptical. I want to be honest about that. I came to these questions as a researcher, not a believer. And I remain technically in the posture of the skeptic. I have not proven anything. I have shown patterns. I have asked questions. I have noted absences. But the patterns accumulate. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. A civilization that was here. Buildings that cannot be explained by the timeline we are given. Institutions that appeared simultaneously across the world. Children without names. Adults with memories of a world that no longer existed, classified as insane for remembering it. Communities of impossible competence materializing in the American interior, sustaining themselves for generations on knowledge whose source they could not always name. Not a conspiracy. Not exactly. Something larger than conspiracy. Something more like a managed forgetting. A world-spanning, coordinated, architecturally ambitious program of erasure and containment. Was this what the asylums were for? Were the orphan trains the last movement of a diaspora we have no name for? Are the buildings still standing around us, the grand train stations, the ornate post offices, the universities with their impossible masonry, are they monuments to the people who were taken away? Or are they the cages that replaced them? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. And that in itself, the fact that we do not know, cannot know, are perhaps not meant to know, may be the most significant finding of this entire investigation. The last Tartarians were taken somewhere. The question is whether any part of what they knew came with them, and whether any part of it survived.